I'm hot and cold. I'm hot and cold.
Where you go next?
Home. And then Montreal. You can come. 26th of March.
Nice.
Yeah. And then a couple little things nearby. And then in the fall, there's something called the Jewish Book Council.
Uh-huh.
And if you kind of subscribe, they'll get all of the Jewish organizations across North America to not exactly bid on you, but and I hear they keep you busy. So I don't know my schedule yet, but that'll be in the fall. Although Canadians are like, I'm not going to the U.S.
They're not going to do what?
Because of the tariffs and the.
Yeah.
But it's not the time for me to do that.
Yeah. Uh-oh.
Here? You can sit on the floor.
Are the mics supposed to be on right now?
I don't know. I think the mics are for the video.
Oh,
it's not mics like.
So it's like it's not a very big group.
No, and as my children
the
always
mic
remind
is not
me, I'm
supposed
very
to be
loud.
doing anything, right?
Yeah, it's just like for the live stream.
That helps me.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. I'd have to put
Are we on like YouTube? Wow, that's terrifying.
We're live on YouTube right now.
Yeah,
To be live on. So.
that's true.
Television.
Okay, we're ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hi, guys. Thank you all so much for coming. Let's give it up for Bonny. I'll kick us off just by reading everyone's bios so we know all the amazing things they've done. But Jeff Gordinier is a frequent contributor to publications such as Esquire, New York Times, Food and Wine, Fast Company, Town and Hall, Further, Airmail, to name a few. He graduated from Princeton University. He's the author of the 2019 book Hungry. Jeff has appeared in Netflix series Chef's Table and Somebody Feed Phil. He lives in Los Angeles with his wife, Lauren Fonda, and their twin sons, Jasper and Wesley. And Bonny Reichert is a National Magazine award-winning journalist. She has been an editor at Today's Parent Magazine and is a columnist and regular contributor to the Globe and Mail newspaper. When she turned 40, a now or never feeling made her quit her job to enroll in culinary school, and she's been exploring her relationship with food on the page ever since. Bonny was born in Edmonton, Alberta, and lives in Toronto with her husband and little dog Bruno. How to Share an Egg won the 2022 Dave Gruber Book Award for Social Justice Writing. So, thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much. I got to say, I'm shocked. I'm so happy there are people here. I was driving over here in the rain. You know, Los Angeles in the rain, it gets a little weird. And I was like, oh, poor Bonny.
Yeah.
I hope that there's, and look at this wonderful crowd.
Wonderful
It
people.
really,
Yeah.
it fills the heart. Thank you so much for being here. Did you want to start by reading a section?
I could.
Let's do that.
Could do.
I was telling Bonny before this that this book is one that you just bask in. It's like poetry. I found it incredibly healing just to spend time with the book, and so I think it's a blessing if we get to just hear some of the
What a
the
kind
sentences.
thing to say.
Yeah.
The reason I sometimes read this early on, and I think of tonight almost like my U.S. launch, because I haven't done a public event in the U.S. yet. So thank you for being here for this very, very cozy U.S. launch. I sometimes, you can see how deep in the book it is. I sometimes start here, though, because this is the first chapter I wrote. You don't write in order necessarily. And I knew I was going to need to write about the Holocaust, and I was still afraid to write about the Holocaust when I started. And so I started with chef school, which was low-hanging fruit. I knew it belonged, and I knew that it would be easier than writing about the Holocaust. So this chapter is called Yes, Chef, and I'm just going to read a little bit of it. I walked into Culinary Skills Lab with a red toolbox in my hand. The blades of my knife glimmered in the fluorescent light as I unpacked them and laid them on a clean towel. Underneath my stiff uniform, a steady thrum of energy pumped through my body. Students all over the classroom were getting ready to work on our first assignment, consommé. By the time Chef came over to my workspace, my vegetables were beautifully brunoised. I'd separated the eggs and mixed them with ground turkey and seeded tomatoes for my raft. Chef was a heavy-set man, tall and barrel-chested, with thick blonde hair cut short. As he approached, I stood a little straighter in my jacket and neckerchief. "Hi," he said, towering over me. "Good morning, Chef." I couldn't believe he had noticed the quality of my work from across the room. Then again, I'd been handling a knife since before most of my classmates were born. "Do you want to see my cuts?" I reached for my carrots. He made a dismissive gesture with his hand. "I have a question for you." "Yes, Chef?" He was so close I could smell his last cigarette. "Are you wearing your steel-toed boots?" "Yes, of course." They were a required part of the uniform. "Show me, please." I pulled up my checkered pant leg and stepped forward with my right foot. He nodded, took a look around, stroked his chin. Then, without warning, he picked up his own steel-clad foot and brought it down hard on the cap of my boot. A wave of vibration traveled through my body. I wiggled my toes. No pain. Chef wore an undecipherable expression until finally, his face split into a wide grin, and I saw he was missing a tooth. "Hey, good thing you weren't lying," he said. I focused my eyes on a dull spot on the linoleum floor until Chef walked away, chuckling. Welcome to chef school.
So I wanted to start by asking you about sort of the structure of the book. It has, if I remember correctly, 56 chapters.
Yes, it does.
Don't let that scare you, because they are delicious bite-sized chapters. As the father of 6-year-old twin boys, I was extremely grateful for this structure because I could read a chapter, then make their snack, then read a chapter, and fight with them about Minecraft. But I found it was just truly, it was a beautiful way to read the book, because each chapter really is structured almost like a dish or a small meal. So I wanted to know why you chose that approach to it.
So that each chapter was always going to be a food. That's where I started.
Right.
And I was I clung to that idea, in the way that we sometimes do. But the chapters were not short. They were long.
Originally.
Yeah, they weren't short like that. And it wasn't working. It wasn't malleable enough with those big chunks. And so when I realized that the chapters had to be shorter, I had a lot more flexibility. But some pieces of chapters weren't about foods anymore.
Yes.
So there are a few chapters that don't have food names, and the perfectionist in me, that's really hard for me, because it was my concept to have every chapter have a food name. But yes, most of that skeletal structure is still there, with each chapter being about a food, because that's actually how I decided what belonged in the book, because that's the road that I built. So it's about different things. It's about the Holocaust. It's about my father. It's about chef school. It's about a divorce. But I knew if something fit or not if it had a food component to it.
So you had to let that go a little bit.
A little. There's a few chapters, like the one I'm going to share in a little while is called Writer's Block, Lost, Passion. There's a few.
Yes.
I had to let go of it a little bit, and that was hard for me.
There's also an undercurrent in the book of wanting to do the book for years, really.
Many years.
And putting it off, or, life takes its course. What is that John Lennon quote? Like, life is what happens when we're making other plans.
Yes.
I kept thinking about this because you keep talking to your father, who we'll get to in a second, about his story in surviving the Holocaust. and yet not really sitting down to. So why did it take so long?
I was terrified.
Yeah.
So this was sort of almost my birthright, I would almost say. I was a writer as a child, and my father is an amazing man, 94 years old, still with us, an incredible man. And when he noticed that I was a writer, he said, oh, we all knew that he had this incredible story. And he said, oh, well, you'll write my story. We'll write it together. And he meant it with, love and inclusion. And it was, a great, flattering honor. But it was also a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
And a lot of responsibility. And as I got older and I became more aware of the magnitude of what was in our background, it became more and more frightening to have to immerse myself in that to the extent that I would have to write a book.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, we did this dance where he said, oh, let's start the book. And I said, not yet. and I wanted to do it, but I couldn't do it for the longest time.
I'm so in love with your father from this book, to be honest. He is just, it's very interesting because as we'll talk about, there's some deeply, traumatic, horrific things that occur that he endured. And he seems like the happiest man alive.
Yeah, he is.
He just absolutely like always full of vitality and like, let's do that. So
sometimes too much. Sometimes I'm like, Dad, I need to go to bed. Dad, I'm tired.
Right.
Yeah.
Extreme dynamism. So talk about that that conflict in a sense that it thwarted my expectations.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book.
Yeah.
This book, not the book that he wanted me to write, which was, a book of a straightforward book of his story.
Right.
But this book where I could create a character for myself that could look at him and show everybody what he's like, right?
Yeah.
It's like enough distance from him to really draw him in full dimension. He's just this force. He's grateful. He's energetic.
Yes.
He's unstoppable. He's demanding occasionally. He's he knows that he's lucky to be alive. He doesn't say it though. Like he would never say to you, whatever. I almost starved to death. Let's go out for dinner. He would never talk to you like that. He's very kind, but he's got a ferocious will to live.
Yes.
Yeah.
I found him really inspiring. I mean, and all, everyone in this room is probably enduring some challenge at any given moment. And here in this country, things are getting weird,
Yeah.
So I'm actually moving to Canada next week.
Okay.
But
you can meet him.
But there are challenges afoot. There's sort of a sense of crisis. And in connecting with your father in this book, I felt that he was a paragon of how one can endure through that, right? Like that spirit. I was like, wow, if we could all have some of that spirit. I'm
going to tell him you said that.
I mean it. I was like, this guy is something else.
Yeah. I mean, when COVID happened, for example, just to give an example, he just couldn't internalize the limitations of COVID. So every time we went over there, and it's in the book, let's go out for lunch. Let's go to the Four Seasons. Let's go. Like the shutting down and the sort of, as I said, the limitations, he just wouldn't accept it.
Yeah.
It's just not. And now too, I mean, if you said the world's going to hell in a handbasket, he'd say, it'll be okay. It's going to be okay. I mean, he's not a stupid man. He knows what's going on, but he just has a way.
I don't want to spoil certain revelations in the book, etc. But there's one moment that really did strike me. It just kind of haunted me when he was on a train with other people packed into the train, and things were dropped into the train. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah.
One of the things
it's one of the stories that I knew as a child. So he had a very unique way of dealing with his background. You hear about Holocaust survivors that won't talk. He wasn't like that. You hear about Holocaust survivors that can't stop talking. He wasn't like that either. He shared, he told stories, and I remember the stories from when I was young, but they were like fairy tales. He had a way of making them kind of magical, and he was like Indiana Jones. He was like a hero in these stories, and it took a long time before I realized that his stories and the Holocaust, this world event, were the same thing.
Right.
Because there was like a dissonance there, a very protective dissonance. I forget what you actually asked me.
Oh, what happened on the train?
Oh, so one of the stories was about the train. They were being moved from one work camp to another near the end of the war. So he had already been in the ghetto in his own hometown, the Lodz ghetto, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Gleiwitz work camp, which was close. And then they were moved from one place to another. It took 10 days on a train. And they put them all in the train, they shoved them in, and the top of the train was open, and they gave them no food or water, and people were dying on the train. They just threw them off the train. And near the end of that journey, the train went through what was then Czechoslovakia, and it went under a bridge, and people on the bridge were dropping bread into the top of the train, and he said that saved his life. Many things like that happened to him and saved his life. That's one example of those good people. He will always say those good people who saved his life.
Right.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're also the central character of this book, and essentially have a happy life growing up, beautiful family. But there is this kind of burgeoning, people talk about generational trauma, people talk about inherited trauma, that even 2, 3, 4, etc. generations further removed from the actual event of, that they feel it in their bones, in their body. And you seem like the one in the family, the youngest in the family, who had that.
Yeah, I was like a third of the way through the book before I could say to myself, yes, we have intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
Because we didn't talk about that. We talked about the Holocaust, but we did not talk about trauma. That was a bit of a bad word in our house, to talk about trauma.
It's a bad word.
Yeah, it was. We were coping. We were copers. We were we were builders, rising above, doing better, having comfort. Like we just didn't talk like that. That was the one thing that we kind of didn't say. So it took a while for me to sort of realize. And, I think Joan Didion said, I write to find out what I think. I learned a lot about what I actually thought just by digging to find out. And I realized then that I was not, like people sometimes say, you were depressed as a child. No, I wasn't. I had like a really nice life, but there was this unexplained sadness. And I would say now that was some kind of internalized trauma
that you were carrying.
Yeah.
And we're not fully aware of what it was.
Yeah. Like as soon as my dad would start to tell a story, I'd start to feel kind of sick. And sick. Like I can conjure it even now, like this heaviness and kind of a little nauseous, like kind of sick. And if I had just said, Dad, your story's making me feel sick, of course he would have stopped. But you're not like that when you're a kid, right? Like the environment is just the environment, and you absorb it, and later on you kind of unpack it and say, I guess I had I knew things that I didn't think I had been told. Like, you
knew things that you hadn't been told. That's interesting.
Sort of. Yeah. Like there was, I just knew there was more than those stories. Like it was vague and kind of you're like a detective. A child is like a detective, right?
Yeah,
And
unfortunately, I know that.
yeah, that's right. And so, yeah, I would now call it absolutely intergenerational trauma.
Right.
But I didn't, even when I started the book, somewhere along the way, somebody said, "Oh, are you going to write a chapter about intergenerational trauma?" And I was like, "Oh, no." But of course the whole book is about that.
Right.
But there's intergenerational, whatever the opposite of trauma, beauty. There's intergenerational joy also
That's
in the
right.
book.
Yeah. I mean, it's on my mind in part personally. My little twins that I mentioned are the great grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. Yeah, on my wife's side. And I just a couple of days ago watched that movie, A Real Pain. That Kieran Culkin won an Oscar for.
What did you think?
Oh, I enjoyed it. I mean, I thought it's so interesting to think. If you don't know the movie, it's about Jesse Eisenberg and Kieran Culkin play young guys who go to Poland to essentially, revisit sites of the Holocaust and their grandmother who's passed. And it made me think a lot about generational trauma and sort of how we process these stories as we come to a century on and further on, as they become more distant. It's still so important to tell the stories, but the distance becomes a factor.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I love that movie, but not because of it has strengths and weaknesses. It's not that. It makes me feel, I feel like I understand something about the need to make that movie.
Yes.
Because for me to make something out of this heritage has been really transformative.
Right.
And to make a piece of work that is not a literal, I didn't just write down the things that happened, but I made something else. And I think, now I'm projecting, but I think I see in that work somebody else, Jesse, I guess, wanting to make something else out of this story. So a transformed version of the story, right?
Yes, and it's also it's unresolved at the end of the film. Like, Kieran Culkin's character, like, literally is in the same place as where you meet him in the beginning.
Yeah.
He hasn't really moved forward, and there's something struck me as emotionally true about that I could see a producer saying, well, let's have more of a transformation, but there seems something actually truer to the human experience, that he's a little bit stuck.
Yeah. When I say transformative, I'm talking about like the act. I'm talking about
your creative work. Yeah,
yes,
absolutely. Yeah,
the act of making a piece of work, a contemporary piece of work, out of historical. Yeah, the
it's like how we keep grappling with these things,
But my way today, right? Not going back in history, except those few chapters that I do that.
Exactly.
The character arcs, I'm not sure about. The truest moment for me is what he says on the train. Which if people, I won't ruin it, but that to me was
intense.
That. But I freaked out like that in Poland, so I got
You
that.
freaked out like that?
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad I brought up the movie.
It's weird to go to Poland the first time you go to Poland as you don't even have to be a child of a survivor, but definitely, or a grandchild. Yeah.
Sorry, it's so heavy. It's also like a really full of delicious food.
Nobody's crying.
No. I mean, you got to address it. But
oh yeah.
I'm trying to hide it, but I got a little emotional. You also grew up in restaurants because of your parents' enterprise and ambition and the lives they built in Canada, which is so exciting. So tell us about your life in restaurants growing up.
It was so much fun.
Yeah.
It was so much fun. We ate there, twice a week, maybe more.
Yeah.
But the most fun was to go when the restaurant was closed and to go with my dad, or I took my best friend sometimes and go poking around in the kitchen and in the walk-in cooler, and I was always terrified of getting locked in there, that big latch.
Yeah, I got a little scared for you and your friend at one point.
No, we didn't, but I was terrified, and standing at the flat top, and those little, in the 70s, they used those little cows that would say medium rare or rare.
That's
you remember those?
Yeah.
And playing in the bar, it was such a fun, I mean, I didn't know that it wasn't like that for other people. It was really fun. And it went with my whole life, which was always about food.
Yes.
My dad loved food. My grandmother, my Baba Sarah, on the other side was a compulsive
She's
cook
amazing,
and
yeah.
eater. And yeah, she is amazing. And a great character to bring to life
right,
here,
yeah.
to have sort of a strong female force too. And that our lives were about food. I mean, my dad had almost starved to death, and then he came to Canada, and he was never going to be without food again, and good food. And my mom loved food too, but more complex.
But it's interesting. One of the things you do very deftly in this book is this sort of demarcations of certain foods are here and certain foods are here, in terms of that's the old world.
Yeah.
And this is the new world, and that's and also sort of class things,
Yeah.
right?
Well, that's
like,
my
well, no,
mom.
that's poor people.
Yeah.
We've moved on.
That's my mom.
Can you talk about that a
Yeah,
bit?
yeah. So my mother, she was a first generation Canadian. So I'm like
Yeah.
a half first generation Canadian. And she had a lot of the baggage, I guess you would say, that first generation kids can have, kids of immigrants. And so she had felt that her childhood was poor, and that her mother was very large and not completely literate. And these things were sources of shame for her.
Right.
And she didn't say that, but it was obvious. And I think I even understood that when I was young.
Right.
And she was moving up. She was moving
That's
up in the world. So, and in a way, my dad had a slightly different way about him, but in a way, they both wanted the same thing. They wanted to work hard. They wanted to rise up. They
Yes.
wanted to have better lives than the ones that they had come from for their kids. And for my mom, it was very much about food. So she was a good cook, but she would not make old country food.
What are some of the old country dishes we're talking
She
about?
would not make brisket, and she wouldn't even let my Baba make brisket.
Yeah, see, that really bummed me out.
We didn't eat brisket.
I was like, you're missing the good stuff.
I had to teach myself how to make brisket. I came from this very Jewish old country family. I had to learn how to make brisket myself in university. I mean, I have a scene in the book where the butcher wants to sell me a piece of meat for brisket. You must know how to make brisket. I was like, no, I don't. I'll make ossobuco. That's what I made that. So brisket, chicken soup we had at the holidays, but my mom didn't make it. Baba Sarah made knishes, and she made blueberry veronicas, which that's the best thing.
See, I really love that chapter. I was going to individually ask you about that chapter.
Yeah.
I thought that was beautiful.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that scene a bit?
Yeah, she lived in an apartment on Jasper Avenue, which is the main drag of Edmonton. She was at our house all the time, but that's where she lived. And I remember going to that apartment in August, and it had to be August because wild blueberries have a season, and it's August. And the cultivated blueberries are not the same. They're very big, and they don't have that deep, right, blueberry flavor. And I remember making these veronicas. So it's a kneaded dough, and it should rest because otherwise it jumps back. That's what she would say. Just, you see how it jumps back? It's not ready.
Right.
And we rolled it out, and she used a mason jar lid. And I have no idea what would be the right size beside that. It's only a mason jar lid. And we used the mason jar lid to cut circles. And then she had the wild blueberries. My cousin's here. She's smiling. Same grandmother. And she mixed the blueberries with sugar and a little bit of flour. Never cornstarch. Never. And you put the little circle in your hand and a spoonful of the blueberries, and then you folded them closed, like a pierogi.
And if they leaked, it was a huge problem.
If they leaked, everything turned gray.
Right.
They leaked, yeah. If you're not careful, they'll leak like nobody's business. She'd say like nobody's business. And they were very delicious. You boiled them. But when I was little, it was a little intense for me.
Intense how?
Like the blueberries, and then there was a blueberry sauce, and it was like overwhelming for me. So she made up something just for me. She took the scraps of dough that after you would cut all the circles, there'd be like all the awkward pieces.
Yeah.
And she cut those into little pieces, and she tossed them into the boiling water, and then she took them out with the slotted spoon, like I could see it, and put butter and then the blueberry sauce, and that was the dish that she
I
made.
mean, that sounds so good. Like these old school Ashkenazi
So
dishes. I
good.
was like, why are you like
Well,
repudiating these?
I've done better. Like
Yeah.
now I've made friends. I've made like internet friends with different people coming out with Ashkenazi food books now.
Yeah,
And
right.
my pride has sort of welled up. I've
Yeah,
gotten
it
much
should,
better. Yeah.
I can't. My in-laws make fun of me. I'm like Pasadena Wasp, and I'm gonna mispronounce it, but like Holland.
Cholent.
Okay, see,
Cholent.
I did it, and on
Cholent.
YouTube I did. I'm
Yeah.
sorry,
Well, it's okay.
but that was also a wonderful chapter about stew. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, stew was another one. This is another one of those dichotomies between old world food and one parent
Right.
and the other parent.
Because you were like, we don't do stew.
My mother
Yeah.
was like, no stew, no
Right.
stew. Stew is for poor people, and I'm not poor anymore, so no stew. So my father, in the old country before the war, remembered this one dish that his mother made, and it was called cholent. And I never thought about cholent as a real dish. It was like a myth. It was like a fantasy.
Right, that's right.
And he would say, my mother made the best cholent, and she would get it all ready. And, you know, you can't turn the oven off or on the
Right,
Sabbath.
of course,
They were ultra Orthodox. But what everybody did was took their pots to the community oven, to the bakery, and they walked them over there, and they put them in before Friday afternoon. And then Saturday after synagogue, they went and picked up their pots and came
Amazing.
home.
Just cooking the whole time.
Yeah.
It's like feijoada
Yeah.
in Brazil. It's just
Yeah.
cook.
Or cassoulet,
Love
which
it.
comes from the same place.
Yeah.
See, yeah.
That's my people.
Right, there you go. See, we're all the same.
We all do it, yeah.
So my dad would say, oh, she picked it up and she brought it in, and the whole apartment building smelled, and everybody knew that ours was the best, and they had it
Nice.
after services, like a big meal dunch, what we call dunch in my house, dinner, lunch, like in between. And he would talk about it all the time, but nobody made it. He could have made it. My mom could have made it. Nobody made it. And it was almost like it was too powerful. It was, you know, my mom probably thought not only did she not like stew, which cholent is stew, you know,
Right.
it's beans, it's barley, it's meat, it's seasoning, it's potatoes, it's stew. So not only did my mom not like stew, but she was a very smart woman. And I'm sure she knew that she could never compete with my father's memories, those
Right.
precious memories before the war, right?
Yeah.
Before his life blew up at 9 years old. So nobody made it. But here I come.
He's dreaming about it the whole time, poor guy.
But he could have made it. It's so funny. You
Yeah.
know, like there's like very often before I wrote this book, it felt like Poland and this life was like centuries away. It wasn't that far away.
That's right.
But there was this dissonance, right? But then after I went to chef school, I was like, oh, I could make cholent. Like, it's not that big a deal. Why don't I try? And of course, the first time was a disaster. My dad told me the wrong kind of meat, and I didn't have enough water. He said, make sure you have enough water. I
Right.
didn't have enough water. But then I got better at it. And I started, when I researched and I saw that cholent and cassoulet came from the same root, cassoulet probably coming from cholent, actually. I was like, oh, I got this, because I had made cassoulet.
Right.
So I was like, oh, I got this. And I wanted to put in duck and maybe a sausage, but I restrained myself. That's, you know, not kosher in all the different ways. Duck is kosher. But anyway,
duck is kosher.
yeah, duck is kosher. But he wanted it. First, I made it authentic.
Right.
And then I played with it later.
Right.
And it was wonderful when I finally got it right. And then the next morning, he called me early in the morning and said, oh, I remembered something else. There was a cake. And so that's how food memories work.
Right.
Right. I got the flavor right, and it made him remember something
Of course.
else.
One thing leads to another.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, duck fat has never made anything worse
No, absolutely
in the history
not.
of humanity.
Absolutely. not.
You were going to read another section.
Yeah.
Why don't we do that
I
now?
have something else to read.
See, I haven't even looked at my questions
Yeah,
because
you were right.
I just
Jeff said it'll
immerse
just
this.
be a conversation.
Well, no, because
and
the
you're
book
right.
really affected me. It's
That's
just like really
wonderful.
stuck with me.
This is a chapter called Writer's Block. You're done playing around. Let's start the book, Dad said. It was a beautiful summer morning, but a familiar heaviness settled on my shoulders and darkened the room. I'd worked hard to find my way to where I was now, and it was back. This choked, nauseous feeling, as if no time had passed, and I was exactly where I'd started, sitting on the carpet, ready to take notes on the horrors of the Holocaust. Saying no to Dad was hard, but changing the subject was easy. Is that really what you feel like doing right now? I said, pushing down my revulsion. I thought we could take a walk. Oh, good idea. Let's go for a walk. We can work later. Later didn't come because that night I got an email offering me the job I had applied for, food editor at a Toronto magazine. I hurried back from Edmonton to get organized. I was excited to put my food knowledge to work and happy to finally be getting back to editing, which had always been a pleasure. I love to listen for writers' voices in the words and help draw out their intention on the page. I love to find the rhythm in their sentences. On a different level, a level somewhat removed from my conscious mind, editing also allowed me to hide a little from myself and my complex relationship with writing. Storytelling had come naturally to me when I was little, but the older I got, the harder writing had become. By the time I was a professional journalist, even small pieces for the parenting magazine where I worked or the occasional freelance article came out in strangled fits and spurts. Sometimes it took me an hour to write 2 sentences. Sometimes trying to write gave me such a headache I had to lie down. What gives a person a 40-year case of writer's block? Mom and I threw out my work when I was 9, planting a seed of self-doubt, but on its own, I don't think that one act would have been powerful enough to plague me into adulthood. But the Holocaust and the book. I honestly can't say how many times Dad suggested I might want to write his story. Many times, once in a while, only a few. Looking back, the pressure seems to have always been there, but when I try to get specific, my memory goes fuzzy. It's only the day I found the suitcase that stands out in crisp relief, the feeling of its handle in my hand, the feeling of weight on me, but also inside me. Maybe every child takes on some kind of burden from her parents, the burden of truth or experience that comes along with the awesome burden of being loved. But the feeling of this particular responsibility was so great, it had almost crushed me. The night before my first day as a food editor, I had looked through my case of culinary books and magazines. By that time, my collection had grown to include Elizabeth David's French Country Cooking, M.F.K. Fisher's Consider the Oyster, and a series called Modern Library Food, edited by Ruth Reichert. A pair of books by Laurie Coleman, Home Cooking and More Home Cooking, rounded out my collection. I ran my fingertip along the spines of my beloved volumes, so excited to join their ranks in my own small way. I had been at the food magazine for a couple of months when my library started to whisper to me. Whenever I walked by, I could hear voices calling me. Sunday afternoons, the sun low in the sky and dinner time hard on its way, I took my books down and sat on the floor, happily surrounded. What should I make? Coq au vin, suggested Elizabeth David. No, oyster stew, said MFK. How about flank steak, Laurie C. said, with homemade biscuits and spicy gingerbread for dessert. Instructions on the page were incidental. What I loved most was the conversation. I was amazed by the closeness I felt to these strangers and the return of a particular feeling, a feeling I had first known writing at my desk when I was a little girl. A type of excitement so intense it verged on anxiety. One day, I pulled down Samuel Chamberlain's Clementine in the Kitchen, about a plucky French chef and her adventures cooking for an American family, and reread Ruth Reichel's introduction. I came to understand that for people who really love it, food is a lens through which to view the world. For us, the way that people cook and eat, how they set their tables, and the utensils that they use all tell a story. If you choose to pay attention, cooking is an important cultural artifact, an expression of time, place, and personality. for us. I knew I was included in us by the way those 2 letters buzzed around in my head. And yet, I didn't admit, even to myself, that what I wanted more than anything was to join in with my own book about food. Not so much a cookbook as a book about the way food made me feel. A book about Bubba Sarah and our restaurants and the layered, textured role food had played in my life. A book about the way food made me see the world. I didn't admit it because I knew I could write no such book. There was something waiting to be written, and it wasn't full of joy and pleasure. The book I had to write was about hunger and suffering and death, a journey into the darkest, most miserable corners of my mind. Since I couldn't write that, I didn't think I was entitled to write any book at all.
Thank you for that. You mentioned Ruth in there. We should point out that we both got
I know.
the Ruth blurb.
The Ruth
The
seal.
Ruth blurb. This
The
is
Ruth
2
blurb.
Ruth. Yeah. That's like the good housekeeping seal of approval
It
in
is.
food writing.
She's
So,
wonderful. Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
I cried when
Yeah.
I got my Ruth
Yeah,
blurb.
yeah, I was very, very excited. Yes.
I grew up here in LA reading her when I was a teenager. Her and Jonathan Gold, who changed my life. Anyway, still.
Me too. That passage
out
really, that just, I was like, she was talking directly to me.
Yeah. Right.
For us.
Yeah.
For us. For you too, right? For us.
What are your own comfort foods?
I cook really simply. Like
Yeah.
I'm looking at my family and it's like I've gotten kind of lazy. And I love bocconcini and tomato salad. I love roasted chicken.
Yes.
I love short ribs. I eat a lot of meat, like I do eat a lot of meat.
Same here.
I love, I like baking that is not too sweet. I've been making these cheddar cheese jelly squares that were my aunt's, and there's like an interplay there between salty and sweet that I love. I don't know. I love eggs, to be honest.
Yeah, me
I love
too,
eggs. I love eggs. I don't know. I mean, it changes all the time, but I really like the simplicity of Italian food.
Yeah.
And I don't know. What about you?
Well, I find it, I'm 58. I find it very interesting. And Jonathan Waxman, the chef who actually is a famous LA figure, but has Barbuto in New York City, he told me years ago, this Noma stuff, you're going to graduate out of that.
Oh.
You're going to get, he's like, I get it. The young chefs want to show off, but you're going to reach a point where you just want some roasted potatoes and chicken.
Yeah.
Boy, was he right.
Oh, okay.
I'm there now. That's like, and I actually I was down in San Diego scouting out restaurants for Esquire. And there was a lot of good places, a lot happening there. And I went to one restaurant, 24, this chef. He's looks like he's 12. And the menu, it was great. He's a very talented guy, but every single menu item had 14 ingredients, right? And we had a great talk. And then I said, so listen, man, Aiden, I want to challenge you. And he was like, yeah. I was like, I want you to have one thing on the menu where all you use is salt, pepper, lemon, and olive oil.
Yeah.
Try that. Just try that. He was like, well, I like bold flavors. I was like, yeah, just try a simple fish with lemon.
That's what I made
olive
last
oil.
night.
Right. I mean, what is better, right?
Yeah.
And he seemed
Black cod.
aggrieved by this suggestion.
Yeah.
This was a threat to his whole ego. And I was like, Jonathan Waxman, you'll graduate out of that.
Yeah, totally.
You'll see.
I'm with you.
Also, watch about 200 people a night going to order that simple fish. So, anyway, we're going to have questions and we might as well do it. Let's do it. Yeah.
Could you tell us how you came up with that title?
Oh, yeah. There was this push and pull between my dad wanting me to write a book and me not being sure I could write a book, but wanting to write a book. And this was always the title because it's based on a story. And the story is, and it won't ruin anything because it's at the very beginning of the book, that when my dad, at the end of the war, my dad was on a death march and he was with his cousin, and they were being marched from place to place to place. And by that time, they didn't even bother putting them in a camp. They were just sleeping out in fields. But this one particular night, my dad and his cousin hid in a barn. And in the morning, the soldiers said, come out, let's go, we're going. And my dad and his cousin didn't come out. And I guess the soldiers must have suspected that they were in the barn because they came into the barn with pitchforks and they were piercing the hay. But my dad and his cousin were up in the hayloft, and they had pulled the ladder up behind them, and they were not found. They stayed, my dad thinks it might have been a whole 24 hours later that they heard voices again, Rouse, Rouse, come out. And when the voices switched to English, they realized that the soldiers were gone and they were being liberated by the American army. And they came out, that was the moment, and they were starving. And all the army had was relish. So they ate relish and they got sick. They were starving boys. And then they had to find food. And they started knocking on doors. They were in the German countryside. And they started knocking on doors, and nobody had any food for them. And then finally, a farmer came back with one egg for these two starving boys. So this is a story I knew. And so I always imagined that if I ever wrote the book, that it would be called How to Share an Egg. And I cannot believe that my publisher let me keep that title, like that title. And that's what happened.
It's a great title.
Thanks, honey.
Thanks. Great cover.
Yeah, it's a great cover.
That's a French illustrator. Her name is Léa Maupetit. And I had seen this before, and I put it in my proposal. Did you do a proposal for your book? Did you sell a proposal?
No, let's not get into that.
Yeah. Okay. I wrote, before I wrote the book, I wrote a proposal that was shopped around to publishers, and I put this art in the proposal. And then again, they bought the art I wanted. It was just like, this is exactly, it's amazing to be so lucky,
It's true.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn.
Other questions? Yes.
I did the March of the Living last year, and your book, and listening to your voice talk about it, I had a lot of the same feelings that you described, this panic, this fear, this thought of how, and your dad was in my head the whole time as I'm listening to your voice. At the end of the book, you wrote, "The power to choose our response."
Yeah,
and
Viktor
it made
Frankl.
such an impact on me that I wrote it down, and I look at it all the time because I know so often my response will be to jump to a conclusion or to panic or to do something like that. And what I took away from the way your dad was able to come to where he is at 94 years of age is this power to choose your response. It was really beautiful. I really, really loved it.
Thank you. It's funny because he doesn't intellectualize these things about himself. So it's almost like when I tell him, I say, you're like this, you're like that. He said, am I? But he absolutely is, right? In that space, right? That space to choose your response. That's what Viktor Frankl talks about. And so he's very like inside his, he doesn't stand away and kind of look, but I'm there to do that. So yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Very special.
Thank you so much.
So do you think that your dad had, because we didn't use that term PTSD, but didn't allow himself to do that, or maybe shared with your mom, that he didn't show to you because you were his daughter?
For sure, he had PTSD. He had nightmares. He's in great shape, like compared to, some people or how he could be. But he has little things. And just a very strong will. No, he did. And he didn't even, the nightmares, sometimes I could hear them. And I had nightmares too, and I wasn't even there. So, that's the intergenerational trauma. I had them from a very young age. So he did have, and then some funny things with food, like he had lived on potato peels, so potatoes were always peeled in our house. So
Oh, wow. Yeah.
there were some things, yeah, but not. There's such a stereotype, about Holocaust survivors, and I really wanted to show that, there's a lot of beauty. Like in one chapter early on, I write about wonder and how I was trying to describe this quality about him, and then I went to a seminar and somebody was talking about wonder, and I'm taking notes in the margin of the program because I was like, that's it. He has this sense of wonder, and it's almost like positive PTSD. It's almost like, he kind of was, I don't want to say born again, but he sort of had this sort of new lease on life that he never lost. But yes, for sure there are things, absolutely.
Bonnie, what was your dad's response after he read the book?
Really positive. And I was nervous because, the book has some tension. There's some conflict. Like you can't just write a book, oh, my dad's wonderful. So I was a little worried. He also can't really see. So I started reading it to him. And then by about the 4th chapter, I was like, I can't do this. This is too weird and too intimate. So he has a caregiver, and his caregiver read it to him. And then that was before the book came out. And I so wanted him to be at the book launch. And I was so nervous about it. I couldn't even talk about it. But then he was there and he made it to the audiobook. And so now he can listen to it whenever he wants. And he loves it. He loves it. Yeah. Yeah.
Couple more.
As an example of Saul's food interest and his wanting to feed people. We lived 2 doors away. Bonnie is our daughter-in-law, and our lovely daughter. And I remember we would go over to Saul and Toby's house for tea at 2:30 in the afternoon, and we'd walk in the house, and Saul would say, "Want a steak?" What can I get you? What do you need?
We rented a cottage once, which is what you do in Ontario. That's what people do. And he was making breakfast steaks. Like he brought up a couple of fillets. He's obsessed with filet. He's obsessed with filet.
Yeah.
And he'd go to Costco and buy the whole thing, right? And he brought up a couple, and the kids would get up and he'd be like, okay, how about a breakfast steak? Who wants a steak? That's how I grew up. Very pampered.
The last time we were with him a few months ago, we had dinner at he invited us for dinner at his senior's place. And as we were looking at the menus, he said, just look at the appetizers. Great appetizers. I don't want you to look at anything else, just the appetizers. And we wondered why. The answer to the question was that afternoon, his caretaker had taken him at his request to a high-end butcher shop, and he had bought, I don't know how many of us there were, 7 or 8 of us, and he bought that number of fillets, brought that back to the chef at the senior's place, and told him how he wanted them made. It was so
Awesome. I kind of wonder sometimes if there's a connection between this history of trauma and then, as a kind of response later, this ceremonial abundance.
Absolutely.
Right. Because like my wife's family, like Thanksgiving is like 42 dishes.
Oh wow.
Right.
Wow.
Like,
Wow.
I don't think some of them are even eaten.
Yeah.
There's just, but this sense of plenitude is so beautiful.
Yeah.
It's a gesture.
Yeah. Yeah. Just, you shouldn't have any scarcity. You should always be comfortable. You should, enjoy. You should have pleasure. And, it's really what I was taught. And there have been times when I've been impatient with it, but of course, now that I'm of an age, I'm like, I'll take it.
Of course.
I'll take it. Yeah.
Do we have one more? Yeah.
I was wondering if your dad has a particularly favorite chapter of your book.
What a good question. I've got to ask him that. Yeah, I mean, I always wonder how he feels. There are some chapters that are really directly about him, and I don't know. I've got to ask him how he feels about that. They really focus on him. I think that he really appreciates the way that the book is about joy and not just about trauma or sadness or heartbreak. And there's some stuff near the end I think he really likes.
Well, it's an incredibly special book. Bonnie's here to sign copies if you like. I can sign copies of mine too if you want one. So we really, really, on a rainy night, appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much.
It's very
for coming.
special. Thank you.
That was amazing. And I'm gonna get both books, but I don't even know what your book's about.
Oh yeah, I didn't really say. It's a